All right. Nick, thank you for the message tonight, and thank you for the prayer. We are in 1 Timothy chapter 6. We'll be there in just a few minutes if you want to be turning there. And for those of you who have followed along this series, you can probably fill in the blanks as to what I'm going to say. And just to find out if you have been paying attention, let's see if you can. This class objective is to understand the dwelling place of God, to appreciate the dwelling place of God, and to be the CJ paid attention. We want to understand, appreciate, and be the way that God intended it. And so after studying the tabernacle and the temple, we realized that God and His people had the same desire, to be in each other's presence. It started that way in the garden in Genesis chapter 1 through 3. There was a tree of life. There was a river that went out from the garden. There was no curse. And best of all, the Lord was present with Adam and Eve. And that's the way it'll end. In Revelation 21, we have this view of a tree of life that will be there. There will be a river of life. There will be no more curse there. And best of all, the Lord will be present. The Almighty God and the Lamb are the temple there. But in between the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Immortality, the sin that separates us from God has created a longing for God. And God had a solution. First, He prepared mankind for His holy presence with holy statutes. He gave them laws when they exited Egypt. And then He gave them a holy structure. The first tabernacle in the wilderness, and then the temple in Jerusalem. Both were glorious in their time, but both were demolished in time. Even Jesus, who had an incredible zeal for the temple and went to the temple many times, prophesied of the temple's destruction. This was a problem for the Jewish worshipers because it was more than a national treasure. It was a dwelling place for Almighty God. Not that it could contain Him, but that it marked a tangible connection with the invisible God. By the time the final temple of stone and gold was knocked over in AD 70, Jesus had built a new and better temple, one that endures, and His presence will be there forever. He said, I will build my church. The gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. This church is not a building, it's a body. In Ephesians 1, we read that He put all things under His feet, that being Jesus' feet, and gave Him to be head over all things to the church, which is His body. The fullness of Him who fills all in all. That body is the church, and the church does something that a building of brick and mortar cannot do. It grows and it becomes a dwelling place of God. He is in it and He fills it. Then in Ephesians chapter 2, we read that the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. And we notice that it's not stone or lumber that's fitted together, it's people. You. Us. I know this may seem redundant, but I can't overstress this. It's a Bible thread from Genesis to Revelation. So many folks have a misunderstanding about a church building we sit in and a church building that we have become. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding about the importance of our presence with each other versus the presence of God among us. If we retreat to the Old Testament view of a building being a place of God, we risk missing out on God altogether. We'll experience some form of godliness for sure, but it'll be an incomplete form because it'll rely on brief encounters where someone only engages in praises and prayer and services when at a building instead of anywhere, because we are the building. This is part of the point that Jesus made to the Samaritan woman who asked about the proper place to worship in John chapter 4. And Jesus said in verse 21, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father. Retreating to an Old Testament paradigm of the temple would mean trying to keep the Old Testament paradigm of sin and law and sacrifice also. It would mean forfeiting the eternal dwelling of God for a false facade. It would be hard to see Jesus in our brothers and sisters if he dwells in a building made with hands. Retreating to the Old Testament prototype of a building for a dwelling place of God would surely injure our ability to be the dwelling place of God and to share fellowship and service and care and joy and pleasure that comes with the communion of brothers and sisters with God there in our midst. So for the temple that now is to function to its full capacity, there has to be at least two foundational and basic things in place. One, a proper identity of who is the dwelling place of God, and two, how we properly behave in the dwelling place of God. And so that's where we come into this study in 1 Timothy, where Paul writes, so that we may know how we ought to conduct ourselves in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. Last week we studied in chapter 6, verses 3 through 10. And there were two groups in the church at Ephesus that were given a message in that passage. One, there was a message to those who were in error doctrinally, and two, those who worshipped or those who wished to be rich. The Bible teacher forgot his Bible tonight, so I'm going to borrow one of these. Let's read together, just to jog our memories, this passage from last week, because it's going to be a continuing thought this week. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses, not 3 through 10. Yeah, that'll be fine. 3 through 10. Anybody want to read for me? All right, CJ, go ahead.
If anyone teaches a different doctrine and does not agree with some words spoken of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with the doctrine conforming to godliness, he is conceited, understanding nothing, but having a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, slander, evil suspicion, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. But godliness actually is a means of great gain, when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. And if we have food and covering with these, we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evils, and some by aspiring to it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now this next section we're going to come back to. We'll come back to it because verses 17 and 21 continues the same thought. So there's a section in there that we're just going to come back to later. Or if it's not the same thought, it's a related thought. In Paul's writings, he has a tendency to revert back to previous subjects, and it reads kind of like a postscript. It sounds like he's done with what he's going to say, and then he says, oh, P.S., and then finishes the thought that he had previously. And I don't know if that's the way it is, but that's the way it reads. And so as this chapter goes on from verse 3 following, it kind of looks like this. We have verses 3 through 5, the meaningless disputes that he talks about. And then verses 6 through 10, the meaningless riches that he talks about. And then we skip a section, we go down to 17 through 19, and he speaks to the rich, and then he speaks about the disputes again. And then in the middle, we have a message about godliness. That's kind of the heart of the message to Timothy specifically. So we're going to continue with the same subject we studied last week as one continuous and thorough lesson, and returning back to the previous section, 11 through 16. So we're going to skip down and go to 17 through 19. All right, just a couple verses. Anybody want to read that for me?
Those who are rich in the present age not to be arrogant or to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth, but on God, who richly provides us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do what is good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and willing to share, storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of what is truly life.
All right, thank you. So as I read through this, notice that this is slightly different than the warnings to those who want to be rich that we talked about last week. These are instructions to those who are rich. And first he wrote to those who were in danger of being rich. They had dangerous desires of being rich. Here he writes about those who are rich and the duties that they have. So let's take this apart a little bit in verse 17, beginning there. Command those who are rich in this present age. This section takes us back to the topic of being rich. The term rich indicates abundance. And if you noticed, the term rich appears 4 times in 2 verses. 3 in verse 17, rich in this present age. Also in verse 17, uncertain riches. Also verse 17, God who gives richly. And then verse 18, be rich in good works. In every case, it's dealing with abundance. So rich can be subjective. Compared to my missionary friends, I'd be considered rich. Compared to some in our fellowship, I'd be considered poor. Remembering that it deals with abundance, in some ways makes these commands more applicable to everybody, because while a person may not be considered rich with money, they may have more of something else with which they are stewards over, such as a talent or health or tools, abundance of transportation, abundance of time, abundance of land or skills or food, or the list goes on. Abundance is somewhat relative. The concept of wealth varies from one society to another. Most people do not consider themselves rich, but compared with the world as a whole, some may be rich. In any case, Paul's observations regarding money and possessions are applicable to all of us in some way. Also, this section begins with a difficult challenge. My version reads, the New King James Version that I usually read from, reads command. Some versions read charge. Other versions read instruct or teach. Command and charge are more literal and loyal to the original here. It means order, to give an order to. And the reason I say that this is a difficult challenge is because people who are rich have a reputation for not taking orders. Imagine Mr. and Mrs. Thurston Howell taking orders from Gilligan. That wouldn't happen, right? Wealth is often associated with power because wealthy people can buy their way. They don't have to budget their way, sacrifice their way, compromise their way, give concessions for their way, or cooperate with others. If you have enough money, you can do as you please without the thought of conciliation. It sounds nice. Maybe, but those attitudes and behaviors often hamper maturity and growth. It doesn't have to be this way. When a person of means exhibits these negative behaviors and attitudes, it's because they have, 1, a false sense of power that comes from money, or 2, a false sense of self-worth from what they've acquired. It's more a matter of the heart rather than a hard rule that people with abundance don't take orders. But riches can affect the hearts and attitudes in bad ways. That's why we have so many warnings about wealth and the desire for wealth. It's a fact, and I know this because of the next line. Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty. Other versions read, not to be conceited or proud or arrogant. Literally, it means high-minded. This attitude is condemned throughout the whole Bible, of being high-minded or haughty. Having a high mind can be expressed in words, but it can also be nonverbal at times. It can be a look or a tone or an attitude. A person can express arrogance without saying a word. But oftentimes, arrogance of the rich is expressed in words. The rich person could say things like, "Look what I've done." But Deuteronomy reminds us, "You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant, which He swore to your fathers, as it is this day." This is a prophet for purpose, and it has to do with covenant rather than convenience. The ability to make money is a gift from God and should be used for His glory. More closely related to conceit, the rich may say, "Because I have so much, I'm better, or I'm smarter, or I'm superior to those who have less." But Paul would warn us in Romans, "Be of the same mind towards one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion." Jeremiah said, "Let not a rich man boast of his riches." While having abundance can be a result of wise living, that's not always the case. In fact, one could successfully argue that a person who has very little to get by on and yet finds a way to pay their bills, make contributions, and even though they have very little coming in, that's the person you want in control of the budget, be it at home or in your business or corporation or in your congregation. They know the value of a dollar. They know how to stretch a dollar. They know how to budget and live within a budget. They know when to save and when to sacrifice and when to give. They've learned how to negotiate. They've learned how to negotiate on behalf of the best interest of the home or the congregation or the business. Today, I find fewer and fewer people know the value of a dollar and lack understanding of budgets. I've heard people say they've reached a place of financial success so that they don't need a budget anymore. I find that reckless. And I've had others who struggle come to counseling having never had to live within their means suddenly be staggered by the reality of debt. How did the American way become so dysfunctional by debt? Could it be that because so many are living in such abundance, we've lost direction? Could it be we've been big on blessings and taught little about stewardship? Debt, mismanagement, wrong priorities, it stunts the home life. It causes marital problems. It drives congregations and countries into debt that renders them impaired. Every Christian needs to understand that we are stewards of blessings, and because we are stewards, we should understand the principles of wealth. So the first commandment, don't be haughty, and then the next one, nor trust or nor hope in uncertain riches. This deals with misplaced trust. It indicates there are riches that are certain and riches that are not certain. What are riches that are certain and which ones are the ones that are uncertain? I think the next line draws a contrast between the two. So, nor trust or hope in uncertain riches, but the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. We'll notice in the next verse that the point of riches is not for pleasure, but here it almost sounds like it is. In fact, as we keep reading, we'll find that using our abundance in godly ways is joyful and it can be cheerful. But it's also a paradoxical contrast to the indoctrination that the world has about enjoyment and riches. Because we live in a material world, we're tempted to put our hope and our trust in material things. And it goes something like this. If I have enough abundance, then I'll be satisfied for life. At that point, one can walk by sight and no longer by faith. At that point, we become self-reliant rather than God-reliant. And at that point, one could easily lose sight of eternity. That's part of the point of Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 12. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 12, and we'll come back to Timothy in just a minute. This is a story that Jesus told in the middle of one of his sermons. Beginning in verse 13, he was speaking, and there was someone in the crowd who said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And Jesus replied, verse 14, "Man, who appointed me judge or arbitrator between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions." Jesus knew what was in this man's heart. It wasn't so much about injustice, but it was about greed. And in verse 16, he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." He had plenty. I don't know how old he was in this parable, but he assumes that he is going to outlive what he has. No longer has to worry about eternity because he has all he needs for right now. He no longer has to live by faith because he has all of it. He can see everything he has in his barn. But God said to him in verse 20, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then you will get what you have prepared, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich toward God." Let me ask you a question based on verse 20. Why did God call this man a fool? Yeah. And in doing so, what did he neglect? He neglected God. He wasn't rich towards God and God's people. He didn't care anything about others. And so while some may say this is a lucky man, he has all this, or this is a shrewd man because he's learned how to farm really well, God says he's a foolish man. Certain riches are uncertain, at least in the sense of durability. In Matthew 6 and 19, Jesus spoke of the destructiveness of moths and rust and thieves. But we could add fire and flood, power outages, hurricanes, earthquakes, market crashes, tariffs, 401ks, the value of gold, interest rates, etc. All these things are uncertain and in a moment can cause wealth to dissolve. It's not durable. And then Proverbs 23 and 5, "For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away like an eagle towards heaven." I know that there's been times where the market's crashed. There's been people who've lost millions of dollars. Their whole life savings have gone in an instant. And I've watched these stories and these documentaries of people who have built an empire and then it's gone. And they jump out of a 20-story window because that was their life. Riches can fly away so quickly. But if the wealth doesn't go away, we do. We pass. And so the rich fool prepared for here and not in heaven. We're going to continue with our passages back here in 1 Timothy chapter 6 in just a minute. Let me pause and ask if anybody has some thoughts to share before we go to verse 18.
He mentioned something along this line that we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain that we carry nothing out.
Yeah. Makes me wonder if there were a lot of wealthy people in Ephesus. We know that there was the silversmith and a great deal of wealth that came from the the goddess Diana and the temple there, maybe there were some very wealthy people. Don't know, but he does mention this a number of times. Nick?
The prosperity gospel totally twists this. And one of the common things that they'll say is well, if you're not rich, then you're not spiritual enough. And if you're generous toward me, these televangelists, if you just give money to me, God will bless you. And so they value their spirituality based on how rich they are. That's totally backwards. Paul is saying the opposite here.
Yeah, the fruitful life isn't based on monetary things like you just spoke about. It's the fruits of the Spirit. CJ?
Who misplaced his riches.
The rich fool misplaced his riches. Yeah. He did. He wasn't rich towards God. Other thoughts? Yeah, Kim.
I just always, I heard this one time, and I always think about it when it comes to something like this, where that's where he said, give us this day our daily bread.
Yeah.
It's not weekly bread or monthly bread or bread for the whole year. It's provide,
Yeah.
at a time.
You're right. Jesus prayed that, and he taught us to pray that way, but to be honest, I don't pray that way often. I think future, and I know a lot of people do. Retirement, things, like this. And Jesus said, take care of us today. And when we're leaning on the shepherd did take care of his sheep that day, and the sheep didn't know what was coming the next day, but the shepherd did. And so I think there's an analogy there. Other thoughts? Carl?
Usually said when he was going to get on the plane and they said, you've got too much luggage, he used this phrase, well, God will provide.
That's right. One of our missionaries, Dr. Moses, he did, through him, God accomplished many things and things that we didn't know would be possible. And he got things from the U.S. to Nigeria that they needed, and we didn't think it would be possible because of weight limits and all kinds of problems. But he just said, God will provide. It was kind of like, give us this day our daily bread, and every day he provided something, and he's a great testament to faith.
I like the wordplay that Paul is doing here with the word rich, and you kind of pointed it out with how often it's used. In verse 17, he says, tell the rich, he says, don't set your hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly provides. And then in verse 18, he tells them to be rich in good works. So really, the wordplay here, I think, is obviously intentional on Paul's part, and I think it's interesting to notice that what riches are we after? Are we after the riches of God or the riches of this world?
Yeah, he certainly draws our attention to this point by using the same word. Yeah, Joe?
Inherently evil about being wealthy.
No. Nope, and we talked about that quite a bit last week when we talked about the desire to be wealthy, and the root of all evil is not money, but the desire, the love of money. That's the evil part. In fact, so if somebody finds themselves with the terrible burdensome predicament of being rich, what should they do? Yeah, the next verse, there it is. Let them do good, verse 18, let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold of eternal life. And so this is where the rich fool failed in Luke chapter 12. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Treasure in heaven is certain. The treasure here is not. It wasn't bad that the rich fool was rich, but his wealth revealed his heart that was bad. His treasure was on certain things. His treasure was on foolish things, not in heaven. Wealth brings opportunities. He didn't use his wealth for the opportunities to do good. He didn't share, nor did he make use of his unique position to promote eternity. And this is part of the principle that Jesus is teaching in Luke chapter 16, where he speaks of this parable of of the shrewd steward. He said, I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. And so imagine meeting souls in heaven who are there because of your good works and your faithful contributions that laid the foundation for eternity in their lives. That's not to say that we can purchase salvation for anybody, but generosity, good works, being ready to give, willing to share, stores up a good foundation for the time to come that he talks about here in verse 18. And that's not just for the recipient, but also for the giver. How? Well, maybe for some, getting rid of distractions helps to focus on the destination. And here's what that looks like. In Luke chapter 10, there was a rich man who came to Jesus. And he said, Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? You remember the story? Jesus talked to him about what the law says, and he went through a list of things that he did, and he was a really good man. And then Jesus said, looking at him and loved him, he didn't look at him with hate or anger, with love. And he said, one thing you lack, go your way, sell whatever you have, and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come and take up your cross and follow me. He went away sad because he had great wealth. On the other hand, there was another man who had a lot of wealth. He was a little man named Zacchaeus. And when the Lord came by, Zacchaeus stood and he said, Look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor. And Jesus said, Today salvation has come to your house. It's not because he gave half of his goods to his poor, but salvation came to his house that day because Jesus came to his house, and Jesus is the greater treasure than all of the other wealth that he had. John asked the question, 1 John, Whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. Good point, John. We're interested in hearts over bigger homes. In the house of God, love banks replace money banks. In the house of God, there's a stark difference in the motives that guide the accounts of the institutions of the world and those that guide the budgets of this house. In the house of God, rich and poor share equal status. In fact, James 2 and 5, God has chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised those who love him. Wealth and poverty are realities of this kingdom. You'll find them both in the house of God. People who are wealthy and people who are poor. But that's different. But what's different is that in this house, the wealthy and the poor both love each other. In the house of God, both the wealthy and poor have the same inheritance. Both give with cheerful hearts. Both are part of the same body. Both answer to the same head. Both wear the same name of Christ. Both rely on grace. Both have tasks to do. Both consider this house, this church, this temple, this kingdom and our King primary over the wealth of the world. So we see in the Old Testament records and in Jesus' words and the teachings of John and James and Paul that wealth can be a distraction. Wealth and the pursuit of it can lead to many snares. But wealth is not bad. When used rightly, wealth can open opportunities for evangelism. It can magnify the name of the house of God. And when it's used rightly, it has a deep impact on those who give and those who receive and those who are even watching. Let's pause there. Other thoughts and comments through verse 18? 19, 20? No.
His name was ironically Timothy.
Oh.
And he did something like we'd go out to eat sometime, and then he would buy it, and he would say, and I don't know if he was familiar. I'm sure he was familiar with Timothy. But he would say, I said, Tim, you don't have to do that. I got my own money. I can do it. And he would say, I didn't have this money some time back. I have it now. I can guarantee you I'm not gonna be taking it anywhere when I leave this earth. So I might as well do some good with it.
Yeah, it's a good attitude. Good attitude.
I notice in verse 19, the New King James leaves out the word treasure. The ESV says, thus storing up treasure for themselves is a good foundation, and it's referring to what he says in verse 18 about being generous. It seems like Paul is making a contrast as to what kind of treasure we can have and what really treasure is. Most people think treasure, you got to accumulate as much of it as you can. Well, here Paul's saying, no, the real treasure is in being generous. And doing good with it. That is where the real treasure lies, is in that.
The real treasure is being generous. And isn't it enjoyable to be able to be generous? Sure is. What is it that Garfield always says? You can't outgive.
God.
Can't outgive God. Right? And he talks about what Jesus said, that it's more blessed to give than to receive, and he talks about this a lot. How enjoyable, how wonderful it is to be able to give and to be generous. All right, Dan, and then Daryl.
And you know, how it feels good to give to people. And I think what gets in the way of our generosity, me included, is we always want to make sure we have enough for ourselves before we give time to see somebody else. And I find that in my own life. I don't know if other people deal with that. You know, yeah, you want to be concerned and take care of yourself, but you got to learn to be generous and give away if you got more. And it's hard for us as Americans to wrap around, and Christians to wrap around on that at times.
Yeah,
I struggle with that all the time. I don't know if anybody else does that.
I agree, Dan. Sure. I struggle with that too.
So one of my peeves, and I don't know, I'm a bad person, I don't know what it is, but, you know, this homeless epidemic, and when I drive a lot, I'm in a lot of different places and stuff, and just, it seems like every corner you go to, somebody's got a sign, somebody's holding this up, and, you know, I always think about that, you know, and I just, you know, sometimes it angers me, to be honest, you know, it angers me, you know, and I know that's probably not the way that I should feel about that, but, you know, how do you deal with that? How do you address that?
Jim told us a good story before.
Yeah. Follow
Well, yeah, I'll go to the gas station, yeah, no, I know, but,
Follow him.
and Danny, no, I don't feel that way, so just so you know.
Yeah, I know, I understand. I get angry about that too. Nick could tell you a couple more stories, I think, of when we were together and people approached us and there's things that we can do and there's things that we cannot do, to be honest. You know, there's problems that are out there that we really can't solve. There's something that I do every week to help one of our shut-ins. And I do it faithfully every week. It's one of the easiest things that I do throughout the week, and I enjoy doing it. And somebody was complaining to me one day about all the things that's wrong with this world. And I agree with that person. But she was so upset and so angry that she was just vomiting accusations towards everybody. And my point, and so I said to her, but what are you doing about it? The whole homeless crisis I can't solve. World hunger I can't solve. But I can make a difference in that one person that I go to every week and do something for her, right? And so there's things that we can't resolve, but there are things in our realm that we can do. And I think that's the important thing, that if we can do it, if we have the abundance, the ability to do it, we do it. Garfield, you had something to share.
Mentioned a giver in the New Testament. His name was Barnabas. He sold his land and he gave it. There's two types of givers. That's in the 5th chapter. It's the 4th chapter, last part of 4th chapter of Acts. And the other type of givers in the 5th chapter of Acts is Ananias and Sapphira. They lied about their giving, and God struck them dead on that occasion. You know, but they didn't have to lie. He would have accepted their gift, but they wanted to be like Barnabas.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, sometimes wealth and notoriety kind of go together, and we have to be careful about that. Kim?
You did back there, and I think it's the fear of the unknown. You don't know what's around the corner, so that's why you kind of want to hold on to not be generous and just give everything away. I think it's just, some unknown fear that you have. And the other comment to what Daryl said, I was told like 30 years ago when I started working in North Carolina, a guy I worked with said, and that's kind of when the people were coming out, or when I started noticing more, I guess, being in that city in Charlotte, the people on the corners and stuff, and when you found out that maybe they all weren't poor and stuff, and he's like, yeah, but you never know. He goes, we're all just a paycheck away from being out there. Like you could lose your job at any point, if you really stop and think about it. It's like you are kind of just like a paycheck away or a job away, and you could be out on that corner too.
Right. It's all so uncertain.
Yeah.
It really is. And there's, I think we could also make an argument through Scripture the importance of planning ahead and being good stewards of what we have, and not just wasting things and giving things away that foolishly, right? But on the other hand, when Jesus told the rich young man to give everything he had and come follow him, that wasn't a prerequisite for everybody's salvation. That was specific to that man who struggled with hoarding those things and keeping those things and not being generous, and they were a distraction from following him. Other people, I don't think, have a problem of being wealthy and following Jesus. In fact, a couple years, a year ago, whenever, I don't know how many months ago, we were in a congregation down in Nashville, and I think their contribution that day was like $30,000. It's something like that every week. And at the end of the year, everything that's over, they go ahead and like they have a wish list that they want to do every year. But they make a budget, and anything over that budget, then they go ahead and they do the rest of their wish list. And every year, there's like hundreds of thousands of dollars that they're able to go and do those things. But that doesn't mean that they just wastefully throw everything away, and I don't think individuals should do that either. But there is a time and a place to be generous. Money?
That anointed Jesus' feet or washed his feet with an ointment, and the disciples were upset about it. And what did Jesus say? The poor are always with you.
Yeah, you always have the poor with you.
Yeah.
He's done something to prepare for his burial. And so, yeah, we'll always have the poor with us. That's not saying neglect them, but that's saying that we'll always have another opportunity to help them. Right? I remember we was in Paris, and Sue was with us, and there was somebody asking for money, and she took out her wallet and she gave him some money, and I kind of looked at her like, what? And she said, at least I did the right thing. I don't know what he's going to do with it. You're right. At least she felt good about it. I remember we had the kids at a youth conference down in Indianapolis, Lads to Leaders, and we were out walking the streets, and there's homeless people out there, and one of them had a sign that said, I'm not going to lie, it's for booze. I think he had more money in his pot than anybody else. You always have the poor with you. You always have an opportunity to help somebody who's poor. Other thoughts? All right, I enjoyed the conversation. We'll close there tonight. Nick will share some announcements, and I want to thank you for your participation tonight.